What's up, Westfield? Hope you're doing well still, staying safe and healthy out there. This is the first of who knows how many videos talking about kind of a precursor to our Sunday morning live feed services. And so these are designed to equip you to lead your family well, give you some talking points and some discussion questions for you to work with through your family, whether that family is husband and wife, whether that family is husband, wife, and kids, whatever whatever that may look like for you. I pray that you would use this resource as well. If you're a single person, work through this. Feel free to call somebody up and work through this with them via Skype, whatever. We want to encourage community as best as we can while practicing safe and healthy distancing as well. If you see me looking around, I got some notes down here. I got a screen over here showing me my face and how ugly it is, but that's neither here nor there. Um, this isn't ideal. We'd much rather be gathering together and worshiping God in our sanctuary that God has so richly blessed us with. But we trust in the sovereignty of God, that God indeed does know what He's doing, and He's going to use you. He's going to use you and your family in a mighty way. He's going to use this time to strengthen your family, and you're being prayed for daily that you will indeed lead your family and lead your family well. This is hopefully going to be useful to you. I don't want to waste your time. It's going to be very short and concise. Hopefully you're going to be able to catch the live feed tomorrow. This video should be going out on a Saturday, ideally, and so you'll be catching the live feed on Sunday morning. It'd be good to watch this beforehand. It's going to give you a little precursor to the text and the main topic, and then again I'm going to be giving you some discussion questions and discussion points to work with through your family. And so Brian's going to be preaching on the grace of God, and he's going to be primarily preaching from 1 Corinthians 15. He's going to be honing in on verses 10 and 11. 1 Corinthians 15, 10, and 11. And to understand that well, you got to understand what's happened right before it. Paul, in a very succinct, concise way, has given us the gospel terminology. These are the essentials. And he talks about things like that Christ lived a perfect life. He died a sacrificial death. He rose again from the grave. He did all of these things according to the scripture. He appeared to all these people to verify what had happened. And in a nutshell, though, what Christ did on the cross is the gospel, right? That's the gospel that we need to believe in order to receive the free gift of salvation that God is giving us. And so he goes through and he explains what that is. And then not only does he just explain what that is, he also, at the end there, talks about, just kind of almost throws in this idea of grace. And it's not thrown in there unintentionally. It's very purposeful for its placement. One of the reasons I think that it's placed there is because the gospel is the primary means of grace. It's how we know what grace is, and it's the ultimate form and sign of grace from God to people. But right before verse 10, he's talking about all these different people that Jesus appeared to, and the groups of people that he appeared to. And then he comes down to verse 8. And in verse 8, he says the last person that Paul mentions is himself, that Christ appeared to him. And then in verse 9, he talks about the idea that he's not even worthy to be a messenger of such a message. Um, and then in verse 10, that's when he discusses the grace of God. And what we're going to see is that it's the grace of God that makes Paul worthy of being a messenger, meaning that Paul's worth comes from God. It doesn't come from any outside sources. It doesn't come from anything. It doesn't come from education. It doesn't come from job. It doesn't come from money. It comes from God Himself. And that's the same then, yesterday, today, and forever. That's a truth that will be there. It's a truth that is a constant and that will remain. Is that our worth comes from God, and it's the grace of God that helps us to receive that worth. So let me read to you verses 10 and 11 and then give you some discussion points and some questions as well. Uh, Starting in verse 10, but by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, so we proclaim, and so you have believed. So I want to give you three talking points. I'm going to rattle them off very quickly and then come back and visit each one with some questions. The first one is this: is God's grace is clearly shown in the gospel. God's grace is clearly shown in the gospel. The second one is God's grace is what saves us, not our own power. God's grace is what saves us, not our own power. And then thirdly, God's grace should motivate us. All right, one more time, rapid succession. God's grace is clearly shown in the gospel. God's grace is what saves us, not our own power. And God's grace should motivate us. So let's revisit that first one. God's grace is clearly shown in the gospel. When you talk about this idea, explain to your kids and whoever you're with who and what the gospel is all about. The gospel is all about Christ. It's not about us. We are the recipients of what Christ did, but Christ is the primary character in the gospel. And explain to your kids using very similar language as to what Paul previously used in just a few verses earlier. Explain to them what it is and how that is the picture of grace. And so some questions that you might could explain to or that you could use here is how is grace shown in the gospel? And then you should also maybe begin by just simply defining what grace is, which is receiving something that we did not deserve. And so you may want to start there if you have younger kids, especially older teenagers or even upper elementary school children will probably understand what that word means, but start where you think that you should. And explain to them what the gospel is, and then ask them, how is grace shown in the gospel? And the primary answer to this, or one of the answers that you might come up with, is that he did not have to do anything that he did, but he still chose to do that very thing. He chose to die on a cross. He chose to live a perfect life. He chose to die a sacrificial death and rose again on the third day. And he did all of these things because he wanted to restore that relationship with us to God. Secondly, God's grace is what saves us, not our own power. And so ask your kids a question. Like, this grace in this gospel sounds cool, but how do we make our relationship right with God? What is it that it takes? What good deed, what action can we do? And it's a trick question because the answer to that is nothing. There is no good deed that could be done. And Paul even admits this. He says, I worked harder than any of them in verse 10, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Paul worked extremely hard. He was very diligent and he attempted to earn the grace of God, knowing that he was incapable of doing so much later. Paul worked much harder than you would, and definitely much harder than I would, to earn God's grace, and he was not able to do that. Um, and so thankfully, we don't have to earn it. God freely gives us that grace. And that grace is shown through the gospel and it's shown through salvation to us. And it's nothing in our own power that we can receive salvation. And so ask your kids the question, how do we earn salvation? And we can't. That's not something that we can do. We get it because God is gracious to us. And then thirdly and lastly, God's grace should motivate us. This is pretty clear cut and dry. God's grace should motivate us to show grace to other people primarily. And so here's some questions of application that I think that you could use. Ask your family or yourself, um, who is it that I need to show grace to? And then follow that up with, how can I show grace to that person? Who is it that I need to show grace to, and how can I show grace to that person? So discuss the idea that God's grace is clearly shown in the gospel, and ask your kids what the gospel is and explain it to them and illustrate how grace is shown through that. God's grace is what saves us, not our own power. Ask your kids the question, what is it that you can do to earn salvation? And then trick them, but lovingly trick them, and tell them that there's nothing that they can do. It's all by the grace of God. And then God's grace should motivate us. Ask the question, who should I show grace to, and how can I show grace to that person? I hope that you find this helpful. Know that you are prayed for and that you are blessed by God. And we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.